Case 1. Jimmy Swaggart. On a humid Louisiana evening in October 1988, America's most powerful moral crusader was photographed emerging from a seedy motel room with a prostitute named Deborah Murphy. The grainy surveillance images would destroy the empire of Jimmy Swaggart, the fiery Pentecostal preacher who had spent decades condemning sexual sin from pulpits across the globe while secretly living the very lifestyle he publicly denounced. Swaggart wasn't just any televangelist. He was the undisputed king of Christian television, reaching 142 countries with his passionate sermons and generating over $150 million annually through his worldwide ministry. His thunderous voice had shaken auditoriums filled with tens of thousands of believers who hung on his every word about moral purity and righteous living. He was the man who had single-handedly destroyed fellow evangelists Jim Bakker and Marvin Gorman by exposing their sexual scandals, positioning himself as the moral authority who would cleanse Christianity of its hypocrites. But those surveillance photographs revealed the stunning truth. The man who had built his empire on moral superiority was secretly paying for sex with prostitutes in cheap motels along Airline Highway. The evidence was undeniable, the hypocrisy breathtaking, and the fall would be spectacular. On February 21, 1988, Swaggart stepped behind the pulpit at his family worship center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, before a packed congregation and television cameras broadcasting to millions worldwide. With tears streaming down his face and his voice breaking with emotion, he delivered what would become one of the most infamous confessions in television history. "I have sinned against you, my Lord, and I would ask that your precious blood would wash and cleanse every stain until it is in the seas of God's forgetfulness." The tearful confession became instant cultural phenomenon, replayed endlessly on news broadcasts and late-night comedy shows. But behind the dramatic performance lay devastating betrayal that would destroy not only Swaggart's ministry, but also the lives of countless believers who had trusted him with their faith, their finances, and their family's spiritual welfare. This was only the beginning. What you're about to discover are 10 shocking cases of famous preachers whose moral authority became the perfect cover for devastating betrayals that destroyed marriages, shattered congregations, and exposed the dark truth about how spiritual power can corrupt even those who claim to speak for God Himself. Welcome to Savage Case Files, where we expose the shocking truth behind those who abuse positions of ultimate trust and authority. If you're fascinated by true crime documentaries, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about moral authority and spiritual leadership. Case 2. Ted Haggard. Ted Haggard commanded respect as one of America's most influential evangelical leaders, serving as senior pastor of New Life Church in Colorado Springs, a megachurch empire boasting 14,000 members and wielding enormous political influence. His charismatic leadership and conservative theological positions made him a trusted advisor to the White House, where he regularly counseled President George W. Bush on moral and spiritual matters affecting national policy. Haggard's background positioned him at the pinnacle of evangelical power structures. As president of the National Association of Evangelicals, representing 30 million Christians across America, he wielded unprecedented influence over religious and political discourse. His passionate sermons against homosexuality and drug use resonated with conservative audiences who viewed him as their moral champion in an increasingly secular culture. His political connections extended deep into Republican power circles, where his endorsements could make or break political careers. Haggard's New Life Church had become a pilgrimage destination for conservative politicians seeking evangelical blessing, while his weekly conference calls with White House officials gave him direct input into policies affecting millions of Americans. But behind his moral authority and political influence, Haggard was living a double life that would shock the evangelical world and destroy everything he had built. For 3 years, he had been conducting a secret relationship with Mike Jones, a male prostitute who provided him with crystal methamphetamine and sexual services, in direct contradiction to everything Haggard preached from his pulpit. The relationship began in 2003, when Haggard contacted Jones through escort advertisements, initially claiming he wanted only massage services, but their encounters quickly escalated into regular monthly meetings, involving drug use and sexual activity that continued for nearly 3 years, while Haggard simultaneously preached against the very behaviors he was secretly practicing. Jones's decision to expose Haggard came after watching the pastor campaign vigorously for Colorado's Amendment 2, which would ban same-sex marriage. The hypocrisy became unbearable for Jones, who decided that someone actively working to deny rights to gay people while secretly engaging in homosexual behavior needed to be held accountable for his deception. The investigation began when Jones contacted KUSA-TV in Denver with explosive allegations backed by recorded voicemail messages from Haggard arranging their meetings. The recorded evidence provided undeniable proof of their relationship, while Jones's detailed knowledge of Haggard's personal characteristics convinced investigators that his claims were credible rather than fabricated. As the story broke nationally, Haggard initially denied the allegations completely, claiming he had never met Jones and calling the accusations completely false. But when confronted with recorded evidence of his voice arranging meetings, his denials began to crumble under the weight of overwhelming proof. The downfall came swiftly as Haggard's church board conducted their own investigation and confronted him with the evidence. Under intense pressure, he admitted to sexual immorality and resigned from all leadership positions at New Life Church, while the National Association of Evangelicals immediately accepted his resignation from their presidency. His church's response included a bizarre public restoration ceremony where leaders attempted to pray away his homosexual tendencies, demonstrating the theological confusion surrounding his scandal. The ceremony became a spectacle that further damaged both Haggard's reputation and his church's credibility among evangelical communities. The consequences devastated not only Haggard's ministry but also his family, as his wife Gail and 5 children faced public humiliation and financial ruin. The scandal destroyed his marriage temporarily, forced the family to relocate, and eliminated their primary source of income while leaving lasting trauma on their children, who watched their father's public disgrace unfold on national television. Case 3. Jim Bakker. Jim Bakker commanded a Christian television empire that reached millions of viewers daily through his PTL Club broadcasts, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue while positioning himself as America's premier family values advocate. His partnership with wife Tammy Faye created the most recognizable brand in Christian entertainment, combining theatrical ministry with lavish lifestyle displays that convinced followers their generous donations were building God's kingdom on earth. Bakker's background began humbly with street corner preaching before evolving into sophisticated media empire that included the PTL television network, Heritage USA theme park, and luxury hotel complex spanning thousands of acres in South Carolina. His charismatic personality and Tammy Faye's emotional appeal created compelling television that attracted devoted followers willing to sacrifice their own financial security to support their ministry. The PTL empire represented unprecedented success in Christian broadcasting, featuring celebrity guests, musical performances, and inspirational programming that reached international audiences. Bakker's fundraising appeals generated astronomical donations from viewers who believed their contributions were supporting legitimate ministry work rather than funding elaborate personal luxuries disguised as religious infrastructure. But behind the glittering facade of Christian success lay a devastating secret that would destroy everything Bakker had built. On December 6, 1980, he had a sexual encounter with Jessica Hahn, a 21-year-old church secretary in a Florida hotel room following a PTL ministry event. The encounter would remain hidden for years until the cover-up began unraveling in spectacular fashion. The criminal aspect emerged when Bakker authorized $279,000 in hush money payments to Jessica Hahn, using funds directly stolen from PTL ministry donations. The payoff was designed to ensure Hahn's silence about their sexual encounter, but using donor money for personal scandal cover-ups constituted massive fraud against the millions of believers who had contributed sacrificially to what they believed was legitimate religious work. Bakker's methodology involved diverting donor funds through complex financial arrangements that disguised the hush money payments as legitimate ministry expenses. His position as PTL's ultimate authority allowed him to authorize substantial expenditures without oversight, creating perfect opportunity for systematic theft disguised as routine organizational spending. The investigation began when rival televangelist Jimmy Swaggart learned about Bakker's affair and threatened to expose the scandal publicly. Facing potential destruction of his empire, Bakker made the desperate decision to temporarily resign from PTL leadership while attempting to negotiate a solution that would prevent full exposure of his criminal behavior. But Swaggart's threat triggered a chain reaction that brought federal investigators into PTL's financial operations, where they discovered not only the Jessica Hahn payoff, but also systematic fraud involving tens of millions of dollars stolen from donor contributions. The investigation revealed that Bakker had been systematically looting PTL funds for years to support lavish personal lifestyle, while deceiving donors about how their money was being used. As investigators examined PTL's complex financial structure, they uncovered evidence of massive fraud that extended far beyond the Jessica Hahn hush money to include systematic theft of donor contributions, fraudulent fundraising schemes, and elaborate money laundering operations designed to hide criminal activity from both donors and regulatory authorities. The revelation of the Jessica Hahn scandal proved to be only the tip of the iceberg, as federal prosecutors discovered that Bakker had stolen over $158 million from PTL donors through fraudulent timeshare schemes and systematically diverted ministry funds for personal use, including air-conditioned bathroom fixtures, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, and private jets funded by donations from struggling families. Bakker's downfall accelerated as media attention intensified and federal prosecutors assembled overwhelming evidence of systematic fraud. His resignation from PTL leadership failed to prevent criminal prosecution, while the mounting evidence made conviction virtually inevitable, given the clear paper trail of stolen donor funds. The legal consequences were severe and swift. Bakker was convicted on 24 federal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion, resulting in a 45-year prison sentence that was later reduced to 8 years. His conviction demonstrated that religious authority provided no protection from prosecution when used to facilitate massive theft from vulnerable donor populations. The human consequences extended far beyond Bakker's personal punishment, to include complete destruction of the PTL empire, leaving thousands of employees jobless and millions of donors facing financial losses. The scandal bankrupted Heritage USA, eliminated the PTL television network, and created lasting skepticism about televangelism that damaged legitimate ministries for decades. Jessica Hahn faced years of public scrutiny and character assassination, while Tammy Faye endured divorce, financial ruin, and permanent association with one of Christianity's greatest scandals. Case 4. Bishop Eddie Long. Bishop Eddie Long presided over New Birth Missionary Baptist Church in Lithonia, Georgia, building one of America's most influential megachurch empires with over 25,000 members and wielding enormous political power throughout the Southeast. His charismatic preaching style and prosperity gospel message attracted celebrities, politicians, and thousands of devoted followers who viewed him as a spiritual father figure capable of transforming lives through divine authority and personal mentorship. Long's background combined street credibility with sophisticated theological training, creating compelling leadership that resonated powerfully with urban communities seeking both spiritual guidance and material success. His transformation from struggling pastor to megachurch bishop created an inspiring narrative that convinced followers he possessed special insight into achieving breakthrough through faith-based principles and personal relationship with spiritual authority. His ministry empire extended far beyond Sunday services to include extensive youth programs, leadership development initiatives, and mentorship opportunities that attracted young men seeking father figures and spiritual guidance. Long's passionate advocacy for traditional family values and biblical masculinity made him trusted authority on moral issues, while his political connections gave him influence over legislation affecting millions of families. But behind his moral authority and spiritual mentorship lay systematic, predatory behavior that exploited vulnerable young men through manipulation of pastoral power and betrayal of sacred trust. Beginning in the mid-2000s, Long had been using his position to initiate inappropriate relationships with young male congregation members through elaborate grooming processes disguised as spiritual mentorship and leadership development. The criminal pattern involved identifying vulnerable young men from broken homes or difficult circumstances, then offering them special attention, expensive gifts, and exclusive access to his personal lifestyle in exchange for what he claimed was spiritual submission but actually constituted sexual exploitation. His methodology combined spiritual manipulation with material incentives that made victims feel both privileged and trapped. Long's predatory behavior included taking young men on expensive trips, providing luxury cars and designer clothing, and granting access to his lavish lifestyle while gradually introducing inappropriate physical contact and sexual demands. His victims were systematically isolated from family and friends while being convinced that their relationship with him was ordained by God and essential for their spiritual development. The investigation began in September 2010 when 4 young men courageously came forward with lawsuits alleging that Long had used his pastoral authority to coerce them into sexual relationships over periods spanning several years. The accusers included Maurice Robinson, Anthony Flagg, Jamal Paris, and Spencer Legrand, all of whom detailed systematic grooming and sexual exploitation. The lawsuits revealed disturbing patterns of manipulation involving expensive gifts, international travel, and luxury accommodations that Long provided while gradually escalating physical contact and sexual demands. The victims described feeling trapped between gratitude for his generosity and horror at his sexual exploitation, while fearing that exposure would result in community rejection and spiritual condemnation. As media attention intensified, additional witnesses came forward describing Long's inappropriate behavior and confirming the victims' accounts of systematic grooming through ministerial authority. The allegations created explosive controversy within the megachurch community while generating national debate about pastoral power and accountability in religious organizations. Long's response involved complete denial of all allegations while mounting aggressive legal defense that attempted to discredit his accusers through character assassination and spiritual manipulation. His public statements claimed the accusations were attacks from Satan designed to destroy his ministry, while privately, his legal team worked to prevent detailed testimony from reaching trial. The downfall accelerated as mounting evidence and witness testimony made Long's denials increasingly implausible. His reputation within the evangelical community suffered irreparable damage as prominent leaders distanced themselves from his ministry, while his own congregation faced devastating division over the allegations. The legal resolution came through out-of-court settlements that prevented full disclosure of evidence but effectively ended Long's influence and credibility. While the exact settlement amounts remained confidential, the resolution demonstrated that his legal team recognized the strength of the evidence against him and the likelihood of conviction if cases proceeded to trial. The consequences devastated not only Long's personal reputation but also his massive ministry empire. New Birth Missionary Baptist Church lost thousands of members and faced financial crisis as donations plummeted and legal costs mounted. Long's political influence evaporated as elected officials severed ties with his ministry, while his advocacy for traditional family values became source of ridicule rather than respect. The human cost extended far beyond Long's personal downfall to include lasting trauma for his victims, who faced years of psychological recovery while dealing with community pressure and spiritual confusion. His systematic exploitation destroyed the trust that makes authentic spiritual mentorship possible, while creating skepticism about pastoral authority that affected countless other legitimate ministry relationships throughout religious communities nationwide. Case 5. Bishop Earl Polk. Bishop Earl Polk commanded reverence as the founding pastor of the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit in Atlanta, Georgia, building a charismatic ministry empire that spanned decades while positioning himself as a prophetic voice within the Word of Faith movement. His theological innovations and supernatural claims attracted thousands of devoted followers who believed he possessed divine revelation and healing power that transcended ordinary pastoral authority. Polk's background combined Pentecostal fervor with intellectual sophistication, creating compelling leadership that influenced generations of ministers throughout the charismatic movement. His Cathedral of the Holy Spirit became a pilgrimage destination for believers seeking spiritual breakthrough, while his prophetic declarations and healing services convinced followers they were witnessing authentic divine intervention through his supernatural ministry. His family dynasty extended throughout the organization, as his brother Don Polk served as co-pastor, while various relatives held key leadership positions within the church hierarchy. This nepotistic structure created an insular environment where family loyalty superseded accountability, allowing systematic corruption to flourish unchecked for decades while maintaining facade of spiritual authenticity. But behind his prophetic authority and healing ministry lay decades of sexual exploitation that betrayed the most sacred family relationships through systematic manipulation disguised as spiritual calling. Polk had been conducting multiple affairs throughout his ministry career, including devastating relationship with his sister-in-law, Clarice Polk, that would produce shocking revelation capable of destroying his entire family legacy. The criminal pattern involved using his spiritual authority to convince women that sexual relationships with him were ordained by God and essential for their spiritual development. His methodology combined theological manipulation with emotional abuse that left victims believing they were participating in divine will rather than being sexually exploited by predatory religious leader. Polk's most devastating betrayal involved his relationship with Clarice Polk, the wife of his brother and co-pastor Don Polk. This affair produced a child whose paternity remained hidden for decades through elaborate family deception that destroyed authentic relationships while maintaining fraudulent ministry facade that deceived thousands of unsuspecting followers. The systematic exploitation extended beyond family members to include numerous women within his congregation who were convinced that sexual submission to his authority was requirement for spiritual advancement. His victims included church staff, ministry volunteers, and vulnerable women seeking spiritual guidance, who instead encountered predatory manipulation disguised as prophetic ministry. The investigation began in 2006 when Mona Brewer, a former church employee, filed lawsuit alleging decades of sexual abuse and systematic cover-up by church leadership. Her legal action triggered examination of Polk's behavior that revealed extensive pattern of sexual exploitation spanning his entire ministry career, while family members actively participated in concealing his criminal conduct. Brewer's lawsuit included explosive allegations about systematic sexual abuse within the church hierarchy and detailed accusations about Polk's manipulation of spiritual authority for predatory purposes. Her courage in speaking publicly encouraged other victims to come forward with similar accounts of exploitation and abuse that painted devastating picture of systematic corruption. The breakthrough came when legal proceedings forced court-ordered DNA testing to determine paternity of the child born from Polk's relationship with his sister-in-law. This scientific evidence would provide undeniable proof of decades of family deception while exposing the hypocrisy of his moral teachings about family values and sexual purity. The DNA results delivered devastating confirmation that Bishop Earl Polk was indeed the biological father of his nephew, proving decades of deception and revealing that his brother Don had unknowingly raised Earl's child as his own son. This revelation shattered any remaining credibility while exposing the profound betrayal of family trust that lay at the heart of his ministry. The downfall accelerated as the paternity revelation triggered cascade of additional revelations about systematic sexual exploitation throughout his ministry. Former victims gained courage to speak publicly about their experiences, while church members faced devastating realization that their spiritual leader had been systematically deceiving them for decades. The legal consequences included multiple lawsuits and financial settlements that bankrupted the ministry while destroying the Polk family dynasty. Earl Polk faced civil liability for systematic abuse, while his church lost most of its membership and faced financial collapse as donations evaporated and legal costs mounted beyond recovery. The human consequences proved even more devastating than financial losses. Don Polk faced the horrific realization that his wife had betrayed him with his own brother, while the child he had raised was actually his nephew. The family relationships were permanently destroyed as decades of deception were exposed, while congregation members experienced profound spiritual trauma from discovering their trusted leader was systematic predator. The ministry collapse eliminated jobs for dozens of employees, while destroying the spiritual home for thousands of believers who had invested their faith, finances, and family relationships in what they believed was authentic divine calling. The revelation created lasting skepticism about prophetic ministry and charismatic leadership that damaged legitimate ministers throughout the movement. Case 6. Reverend Henry Lyons. Reverend Henry Lyons wielded unprecedented power as president of the National Baptist Convention, USA, representing 8.2 million African American Baptists across the nation, and serving as one of the most influential religious leaders in American Christianity. His charismatic leadership and political connections made him a sought-after ally for politicians seeking African American support, while his position atop the nation's largest black religious organization gave him enormous influence over social and political issues affecting millions of families. Lyons' background combined street-smart leadership with sophisticated political acumen that positioned him as bridge between religious communities and political power structures. His rise from local pastor to national denominational president demonstrated exceptional organizational skills and persuasive ability that convinced fellow ministers he possessed vision and integrity necessary to lead their historic denomination into the 21st century. His presidential platform emphasized economic empowerment and social justice, attracting support from progressive ministers who believed his leadership could transform the National Baptist Convention into a powerful force for community development and political activism. His fundraising abilities and corporate connections generated millions of dollars for denominational programs while positioning him as a successful executive capable of managing complex organizational challenges. But behind his moral authority and denominational leadership lay systematic financial corruption and multiple extramarital affairs that betrayed both his marriage vows and his fiduciary responsibility to millions of Baptist believers. His criminal behavior involved not only personal moral failures but also massive theft of denominational funds that belonged to struggling churches and community development programs throughout African American communities. The explosive revelation came on July 10, 1997, when Lyons' wife Deborah discovered his secret life in the most dramatic fashion possible. She drove to a $700,000 waterfront home in Tierra Verde, Florida, that her husband secretly co-owned with Bernice Edwards, a convicted embezzler who had become his business partner and alleged mistress, and set the luxurious property ablaze. Deborah Lyons' arson attack represented a desperate act of betrayal and rage after discovering that her husband had purchased the lavish Florida home using stolen denominational funds while conducting an affair with Edwards behind her back. The fire department response to the burning mansion triggered investigation that would expose years of systematic financial fraud and sexual betrayal hidden beneath Lyons's public facade of moral leadership. The investigation revealed that the Florida home was just one element of elaborate criminal enterprise involving multiple extramarital relationships and systematic theft of millions of dollars from National Baptist Convention accounts. Lyons had been using his presidential authority to divert denominational funds into personal accounts while conducting affairs with several women who received financial benefits from his stolen money. Edwards herself brought criminal history to their relationship, having previously served prison time for embezzling funds from her former employer. Her partnership with Lyons involved sophisticated money laundering schemes that disguised stolen denominational funds as legitimate business investments while providing luxurious lifestyle funded by money that belonged to struggling churches and community programs. As investigators examined National Baptist Convention financial records, they discovered systematic theft involving over $4 million in denominational funds that Lyons had diverted for personal use, including luxury homes, expensive jewelry, and lavish vacations with various mistresses. His methodology involved creating fraudulent invoices and authorizing payments to shell companies that funneled money directly into his personal accounts. The criminal charges multiplied as federal prosecutors uncovered evidence of racketeering, grand theft, money laundering, and tax evasion that demonstrated years of systematic corruption disguised as legitimate denominational business. Lyons had been using his position to steal from the very churches and communities that trusted him with their sacrificial contributions for ministry and social justice work. His downfall accelerated as media attention intensified and denominational leaders faced overwhelming evidence of his criminal behavior. The National Baptist Convention suspended him from the presidency, while federal prosecutors assembled overwhelming case that made conviction virtually inevitable given the clear paper trail of stolen funds and fraudulent financial transactions. The legal consequences proved severe and comprehensive. Lyons was sentenced to 5.5 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to racketeering and grand theft charges, while also facing civil liability for millions of dollars in restitution to the National Baptist Convention and other victims of his systematic fraud. The human consequences devastated not only Lyons' personal life, but also the entire National Baptist Convention, which faced financial crisis and institutional credibility destruction. His wife, Deborah, faced her own legal consequences for the arson attack, while dealing with public humiliation and divorce proceedings that exposed intimate details of their marriage betrayal. The denominational impact created lasting crisis within African American Baptist communities, as churches struggled with financial losses and spiritual trauma from discovering their trusted leader was systematic criminal who had stolen money intended for community development and religious programming. The scandal damaged relationships between local churches and denominational leadership while creating skepticism about religious authority that affected legitimate ministers throughout the convention. The broader community consequences included delayed or canceled social justice programs that depended on denominational funding, while struggling churches faced additional financial hardship from having contributed to what they believed was legitimate ministry work, but actually funded Lyons' criminal lifestyle and extramarital affairs. Case 7. Henry Ward Beecher. He was one of the most famous preachers in America, the man every newspaper called the voice of Christian America. But behind the pulpit of righteousness, Henry Ward Beecher was hiding a scandal that would shock the nation, because this man of God was accused of sleeping with his best friend's wife. It's the 1800s, Brooklyn, New York. Beecher is everywhere. A celebrated minister, fiery orator, and one of the first celebrity preachers in America. His sermons packed churches, his name sold newspapers, and his influence reached all the way to the White House. He preached about purity, virtue, and the sanctity of marriage. But behind closed doors, the Reverend was playing a very different role. Enter Elizabeth Tilton, the wife of Beecher's close friend and editor, Theodore Tilton. Beecher was her pastor, her mentor, and eventually her secret lover. The affair allegedly began in the 1860s, in the same home where Beecher often dined as a family guest. Letters between the two hinted at a relationship far beyond friendship, and as whispers spread through the congregation, the facade of the moral crusader began to crumble. In 1872, Theodore Tilton finally broke his silence. He publicly accused Beecher of adultery with his wife, sparking what became known as the Beecher-Tilton scandal. The accusation exploded across America. Every newspaper carried the story. For the first time, a preacher's private sin became front-page gossip. The trial that followed was pure chaos, full of tears, shocking testimony, and love letters read aloud before a packed courtroom. After 6 months, the jury was deadlocked. Beecher escaped conviction, but his spotless reputation was gone forever. Half the country saw him as a hypocrite who preached holiness while betraying his best friend. The other half still worshipped him as a man wrongly accused. Either way, the scandalous saint of Brooklyn would never be the same. Beecher continued preaching, but his legacy was forever stained by the affair that exposed the dark side of early American megachurch fame. He died years later, still admired, but never fully forgiven. Henry Ward Beecher stood for purity from the pulpit, but behind the curtain, he broke every vow he ever preached. Case 8. Randy White. Randy White commanded deep respect as co-pastor of Without Walls International Church in Tampa, Florida, one of America's fastest-growing megachurches with over 23,000 members and an annual budget exceeding $50 million. His partnership with his beloved wife Paula had created a compelling ministry team that combined his business acumen with her passionate preaching, building religious empire that influenced hundreds of thousands of believers through television broadcasts, conferences, and community outreach programs. White's background as successful businessman brought credibility and financial expertise to their ministry, while his genuine love for Paula created authentic partnership that resonated with couples seeking both spiritual guidance and practical relationship models. Their marriage appeared to exemplify biblical partnership where both spouses contributed unique strengths toward common vision of transforming lives through the gospel message. The sudden death of Paula White in 2007 from complications following routine surgery devastated not only Randy personally, but also the entire Without Walls congregation that had viewed the couple as inseparable ministry team. Paula's charismatic preaching and prophetic ministry had been the primary draw for thousands of members, while Randy's administrative leadership had provided stability and financial management essential for their rapid growth. Following Paula's death, Randy assumed sole leadership of the massive ministry operation while grieving the loss of his life partner and struggling to maintain organizational momentum without her dynamic presence. The congregation rallied around him during his bereavement, viewing his continued leadership as demonstration of faith and commitment to the vision he and Paula had built together. But approximately 18 months after Paula's death, Randy made shocking discovery that would force him to confront devastating personal failure that threatened everything he and Paula had built. He had developed inappropriate relationship with a female church employee that had crossed professional boundaries and violated the moral standards he was expected to uphold as senior pastor. The relationship began innocently as Randy sought administrative support and personal encouragement during his grief process, but gradually evolved into emotional dependency that progressed into physical intimacy. His vulnerability following Paula's death had created perfect conditions for poor judgment that compromised his pastoral integrity and violated the trust that congregation members had placed in his leadership. Randy's recognition of his moral failure created intense internal conflict between his genuine love for the ministry Paula had helped build and his awareness that continuing in leadership while hiding his transgression would constitute ongoing deception of the congregation that trusted him. His business background had instilled ethical standards that made concealing moral failure incompatible with authentic leadership. The investigation began within Randy's own conscience, as he wrestled with guilt and recognition that his behavior had violated both biblical standards and professional ethics expected of pastoral leadership. His decision to confess publicly rather than attempt concealment demonstrated rare integrity that distinguished his response from typical scandal management employed by religious leaders facing exposure. On a Sunday morning in early 2009, Randy White stood before his massive congregation and delivered one of the most genuine confessions in modern church history. With tears streaming down his face, he acknowledged his moral failure and announced his immediate resignation from all leadership positions at Without Walls International Church, stunning the congregation that had supported him through his grief. His confession included acknowledgement of inappropriate relationship with church employee and recognition that his behavior had disqualified him from pastoral leadership, regardless of his grief or emotional vulnerability. Randy's willingness to accept full responsibility without making excuses or attempting to minimize his failure demonstrated authentic repentance rarely seen in religious scandal confessions. The congregation's response reflected genuine shock and grief as members realized they were losing not only their remaining founding pastor, but also facing uncertain future for their spiritual community. Many members had invested decades of their lives and substantial financial resources in building the ministry that Randy and Paula had created together. The resignation triggered immediate organizational crisis as Without Walls faced leadership vacuum and financial uncertainty without Randy's administrative expertise and donor relationships. The church's rapid growth had been built around the White family brand, making transition to new leadership extremely challenging for a congregation that had never experienced different pastoral authority. The consequences for Randy proved personally devastating, as he lost not only his career and income, but also his identity as ministry leader that had defined his adult life. His decision to confess rather than attempt concealment cost him financially, while eliminating any possibility of continuing in professional ministry, demonstrating the high price of authentic integrity. The impact on his family included loss of ministry housing, income, and social standing within religious community that had been their primary social network. His children faced adjustment to dramatically different lifestyles, while dealing with public knowledge of their father's moral failure and its impact on their family's future prospects. The institutional consequences affected thousands of congregation members who faced uncertainty about their spiritual home and investment in ministry they had helped build. Many families struggled with questions about continuing their involvement, while others faced financial losses from pledges and investments tied to the ministry's stability and growth projections under Randy's continued leadership. Case 9. Ahmad Corbett. Ahmad Corbett held prestigious position as a high-ranking leader within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, serving in ecclesiastical roles that commanded deep respect within Mormon communities throughout the western United States. His impeccable reputation and decades of faithful service had earned him trust and authority within religious organization known for its strict moral standards and rigorous screening processes for leadership positions. Corbett's background exemplified the Mormon ideal of professional success combined with religious devotion, as his career achievements and community involvement demonstrated the values that LDS leaders were expected to model for congregation members. His family life appeared to embody church teachings about eternal marriage and righteous living, making him trusted advisor for families seeking guidance about spiritual and temporal matters. His ecclesiastical responsibilities included counseling church members about personal challenges, overseeing religious programs, and representing church authority in community interactions. These positions required absolute moral integrity and provided access to confidential information about members' personal lives, creating sacred trust that made any moral failure particularly devastating for those who had confided in his spiritual authority. The LDS Church's emphasis on moral purity and family values made leadership positions extremely sensitive to any suggestion of sexual impropriety, while the organization's hierarchical structure meant that moral failures by high-ranking leaders could undermine faith and confidence throughout entire regional communities that looked to them for spiritual guidance and moral example. But Corbett's carefully maintained facade of moral righteousness concealed devastating secret that would be exposed through entirely unexpected circumstances having nothing to do with his church responsibilities. He had been conducting extramarital affair that violated both his marriage vows and the strict moral standards required for continued church leadership, creating massive liability for both personal and institutional integrity. The explosive revelation came during legal proceedings completely unrelated to his church service, when Corbett was required to provide sworn testimony in fraud case involving business dealings that had nothing to do with his religious responsibilities. During this deposition, attorneys discovered evidence of his extramarital relationship through financial records and communication patterns that revealed systematic deception. The legal discovery process uncovered bank records, travel receipts, and communication evidence that demonstrated ongoing extramarital relationship involving substantial financial expenditures and elaborate efforts to conceal the affair from both his wife and church authorities. The paper trail provided undeniable evidence of systematic betrayal that had been hidden for extended period through careful financial planning and deceptive practices. The deposition testimony forced Corbett to acknowledge his extramarital relationship under oath, creating legal record that made denial impossible, while exposing the full extent of his deception to attorneys, court personnel, and eventually church authorities, who learned about his moral failure through legal proceedings rather than voluntary confession. The investigation expanded as church leaders examined the implications of Corbett's admitted adultery for his continued service in positions requiring absolute moral integrity. LDS Church protocols demanded immediate investigation of any credible allegations of sexual impropriety by ecclesiastical leaders, while the sworn testimony eliminated any possibility of dismissing the allegations as unsubstantiated rumors. Church authorities conducted thorough investigation that confirmed the details revealed during legal proceedings, while uncovering additional evidence of systematic deception that had allowed Corbett to maintain leadership positions while violating fundamental moral standards. The investigation revealed elaborate measures he had taken to conceal his affair while continuing to counsel other members about marital faithfulness and moral integrity. The downfall came swiftly as LDS Church authorities implemented immediate disciplinary action that included release from all leadership positions and potential excommunication proceedings depending on the results of formal church court deliberations. The organization's zero-tolerance policy for sexual impropriety by leaders made Corbett's continued involvement impossible, regardless of his previous faithful service. His ecclesiastical discipline created immediate crisis for congregation members who had trusted his spiritual authority and followed his counsel about personal and family matters. The revelation that their trusted leader had been systematically deceiving them while conducting extramarital affair undermined confidence in church leadership while creating spiritual trauma for families who had confided intimate details about their lives. The legal consequences included potential perjury charges if investigators determined that Corbett had provided false testimony about other aspects of his personal life during deposition proceedings, while his business relationships faced scrutiny due to questions about his overall integrity and reliability as professional partner. The personal destruction proved comprehensive, as Corbett lost not only his church leadership positions, but also his standing within Mormon community that had been his primary social and professional network. His marriage faced devastating crisis, while his children dealt with public knowledge of their father's adultery and its impact on their family's reputation within close-knit religious community. The institutional impact affected confidence in LDS leadership screening processes while creating skepticism about the authenticity of moral standards that leaders were expected to maintain. Congregation members struggled with questions about how systematic deception could have continued undetected, while trusted leader counseled them about honesty and moral integrity. The financial consequences included potential divorce proceedings and division of assets, while his professional reputation suffered permanent damage that affected his ability to maintain business relationships and community standing that had been built on perception of absolute moral integrity required for LDS leadership positions. Case 10. Bobby Winkler. Bobby Winkler carried the weight of extraordinary expectations as the son of prominent evangelist David Winkler, inheriting both spiritual legacy and enormous pressure to maintain family reputation that had been built over decades of faithful ministry throughout evangelical communities. His background combined inherited credibility with personal calling that positioned him as next-generation leader, capable of advancing his family's ministry influence into contemporary Christian culture. Winkler's pastoral ministry reflected careful grooming and theological training that prepared him for leadership responsibilities within evangelical movement that valued both doctrinal orthodoxy and practical ministry effectiveness. His family name opened doors and created opportunities that would have been impossible for pastors without such distinguished ministerial heritage, while establishing expectations for moral excellence that matched his inherited authority. His congregation viewed him not only as their spiritual leader, but also as continuation of family dynasty that had shaped their faith community for generations. The trust and respect he commanded extended beyond typical pastoral authority, to include deep emotional investment in his success as representative of ministerial lineage that had defined their spiritual identity and community values. The weight of maintaining family reputation while managing personal pastoral responsibilities created intense pressure that Winkler struggled to balance throughout his ministry career. His position required absolute moral integrity while providing limited accountability structures that could have detected developing problems before they reached crisis proportions, threatening both personal and family legacy. But behind his inherited authority and congregational trust lay a devastating pattern of multiple extramarital affairs that had been concealed for several years through systematic deception and careful management of his public image. His moral failures represented not only personal betrayal, but also potential destruction of family ministry legacy that extended far beyond his individual responsibilities. The affairs involved multiple women over an extended period, demonstrating systematic pattern of sexual exploitation rather than isolated moral failure that might have been attributed to momentary weakness or circumstantial vulnerability. His methodology involved using pastoral authority and counseling opportunities to identify and pursue vulnerable women within his congregation and broader ministry network. Winkler's systematic deception required elaborate efforts to conceal his extramarital relationships while maintaining the facade of marital faithfulness and moral integrity expected from pastoral leadership. His position provided perfect cover for inappropriate relationships disguised as legitimate ministry interactions, while his family reputation created presumption of moral reliability that prevented scrutiny of his personal conduct. The investigation began within Winkler's own conscience, as mounting guilt and recognition of his systematic betrayal created an internal crisis that made continued deception increasingly difficult to maintain. His awareness that discovery was inevitable, combined with growing psychological pressure from years of double life, created a perfect storm that demanded resolution through either confession or exposure. The breakthrough came when Winkler made an unprecedented decision to create a video confession documenting his moral failures and announcing his resignation from pastoral ministry. This recorded statement provided detailed acknowledgement of his extramarital affairs while accepting full responsibility for systematic betrayal of his wife, congregation, and family legacy that his behavior had damaged. His video confession included emotional testimony about years of deception and systematic moral failure that had violated both his marriage vows and pastoral calling. The recording demonstrated genuine remorse, while providing specific details about his affairs that eliminated any possibility of minimizing or excusing his behavior through circumstantial explanations or spiritual manipulation. The public release of his video confession created an immediate crisis for his congregation, which learned about their pastor's systematic infidelity through recorded testimony rather than private acknowledgement or gradual revelation. The video format intensified the emotional impact while providing a permanent record of his moral failure that could be replayed and distributed throughout evangelical communities. The downfall proved immediate and comprehensive as Winkler's confession eliminated any possibility of attempting damage control or gradual rehabilitation that might have preserved some ministry opportunities. His decision to document his failures permanently ensured that his pastoral career was definitively ended while creating lasting impact on family reputation and ministry legacy. The congregational response reflected profound shock and betrayal, as members realized their trusted pastor had been systematically deceiving them while conducting multiple affairs. The revelation destroyed confidence in his spiritual authority, while creating a crisis about whether his previous preaching and counseling had been authentic ministry or elaborate performance designed to maintain his position. The family consequences proved devastating as Winkler's wife faced public humiliation and marriage destruction while dealing with detailed knowledge of his multiple infidelities. His children encountered permanent damage to their family reputation while struggling with the loss of a father figure who had represented both personal security and spiritual authority throughout their development. The generational impact extended beyond immediate family to include potential destruction of ministry legacy that had been built by his father and previous generations. The systematic nature of his moral failures created lasting questions about family integrity, while potentially eliminating opportunities for future generations to continue ministerial work within communities that had lost confidence in family leadership. The institutional consequences affected not only his immediate congregation but also broader evangelical communities that had supported his family's ministry over decades. His confession created skepticism about ministerial accountability and succession planning, while demonstrating how inherited authority could become cover for systematic moral failure rather than guarantee of continued integrity. The collective destruction wrought by these 10 religious leaders extends far beyond individual scandals to represent systematic crisis that has fundamentally altered public perception of religious authority and spiritual leadership throughout American Christianity. Each case demonstrates how trusted spiritual positions can become platforms for exploitation rather than service, creating lasting trauma that affects not only immediate victims but entire communities that invested faith, finances, and family decisions based on fraudulent moral authority. I want to ask you for a favor. Subscribe to Savage Case Files now. Your subscription keeps us inspired to make more true crime stories like this one.